Hey everyone, welcome to the first content video for Philosophy 101 Online. Just one thing I want to mention in terms of grading is that on the assessments you may see content from here, these videos, as well as content from the readings. There will be a lot of consistency there, but there may be some questions that appear in the readings that I do not always address here. So just make sure you're doing the readings, taking good notes, and watching the lectures and taking good notes, and you'll be prepared for the assessment. Okay, so in this video what I want to do is introduce you to philosophy, and I'll be going over the PowerPoint that is available in the module on Canvas, but you'll see the slides pop up occasionally and cover my image temporarily as well. And you'll also notice that on the PowerPoints there's a list of what are called major ideas, and these ideas are also listed in the reader at the beginning of the chapter. So if you ever need a guide for studying, that's what you should follow. And I will tend to focus on those ideas as we go along, and you'll see how they're reflected on the PowerPoints as well. Okay, so anyways, I'm going to get started, and you'll notice in this particular PowerPoint that at the beginning, before it even gets to the major ideas, there are a couple slides. One says, "Why are we doing this?" And the other one says some negative consequences to studying philosophy. So none of this stuff is going to appear on the assessment. This is just the first content PowerPoint, so I need to tell you, why are you here? Why are we making you take this class called philosophy? What is philosophy? And we'll talk more about what it is later, but as you can see, there are three reasons given for why you might study philosophy, and they are: it makes you smarter, wiser, and more open-minded. So the first reason to study philosophy is that it tests your mind. It works your brain. It makes you think about things that you've probably already thought about before, but in a much deeper, more analytic way. God, for instance. Everybody's thought about God, even if you're an atheist, but nobody's thought quite as much about God as philosophers, who have looked at it from every angle. So one of the benefits philosophy can give you is looking at topics in a way that you haven't seen them before, and doing it in a very rigorous, rational way that helps you develop a better understanding of those topics for yourself. This is also, by the way, reflected in philosophy majors' test scores. They tend to do very well on analytic tests like the GRE, which is the graduate requisite exam to get into graduate school, the MCAT, the test for medical students, or the LSAT, the test for lawyers. Philosophy majors do very well on these because their minds have been tested and worked. So philosophy makes you smarter in that way. It also makes you wiser in the sense that when you're looking at all these new topics, like I said, you see them in different ways that you hadn't seen them before. So you may not change your own opinion, but you might come to see, oh, I get it. I get why people see, abortion or whatever in that way. I understand their point of view now. So it makes you a bit wiser and a bit more open-minded to study philosophy as well. It sort of broadens your perspective and your horizons in a way that can be very beneficial for your life in the academic world and beyond. So that's my spiel about why you should be studying this. On the other hand, there are some negatives to studying philosophy, as you can see in that next PowerPoint. And one is that because you're thinking about things from so many different angles, it can sometimes lead you to overthink and to overanalyze. And so let's remember that philosophy has a place and a time. Even professors like myself will oftentimes forget about philosophy and just enjoy my life on the beach or with friends at a bar or whatever. So just remember that philosophy can lead to too much overthinking. It's good to think a lot, but too much can be too much. And also sometimes it makes us think we're smarter than everyone, because in philosophy you learn a lot of new phrases and terminology, big words that can make you sound good to other people. Just remember that it doesn't make you better than anyone because you know a few more words. It makes you maybe generally smarter, as I explained before, but it doesn't make you better than anyone or smarter necessarily than anyone else. It makes you smarter. That doesn't mean you're smarter than everyone else. But anyways, that's sort of my spiel about the positives and negatives of philosophy. I obviously would argue that the positives outweigh the negatives, and especially if you're just taking an intro class, this class can benefit you greatly in terms of your critical thinking skills and general wisdom about life. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the material. And as I said, I have a slide in every PowerPoint that lists the major ideas. And usually I'll give you just a brief overview, and then we'll go into depth in the rest of the lecture on those. You can always fast forward the lecture to particular ideas that you were struggling with. But anyways, you can see a list of 6 major ideas there. And today I'm going to go through all of those. We're going to look at what philosophers study, the different branches or categories or divisions of philosophy. We're going to look at what wisdom and knowledge and belief are. Philosophy is defined as love of wisdom, which raises the question, well, what is wisdom? How does it relate to knowledge? Philosophers use reason. They make arguments. They provide evidence and justifications for their views, be it about God or about abortion or anything else, as we'll see, be it about what the best society should be, what the best form of government is. So we'll talk about reason. Fallacies and biases are when reason goes awry, when it goes the wrong way. Fallacy means a mistake in reason, so we have to know how to navigate appropriately these topics using reason. And we also want to make sure that we don't navigate inappropriately using fallacies and biases, and we'll talk about that. And then we're going to go over some misunderstandings of the discipline that crop up here and there. So let's start with wisdom, knowledge, and belief. Once again, philosophy literally translates from the Greek. It's a Greek word that goes back several thousand years, and it means love of wisdom. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. So that raises the question, like I said, how does that relate to knowledge? Because we often see those two things as being related. At the same time, I bet all of you know that knowledge and wisdom are also different, because we know people who we would describe as very knowledgeable, but we may not describe them as wise. Vice versa, you may know somebody who's very wise, but you wouldn't describe them as very knowledgeable. And most of us are probably somewhere in between. We have a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of knowledge. But wisdom is hard to pin down, and we're not going to get a perfect definition here. One way I like to describe the difference is that a wise person is typically seen as a person with street smarts, right? Somebody who kind of just fits into every situation and knows what needs to be said or needs to be done. If somebody's freaking out, they know how to calm them down. If something needs to get done, we need to get somewhere, and they're in a group, they kind of know how to navigate that group to make it happen. They also know the right things to say in difficult situations. So wise people are people who are kind of tuned in to the universe. And all the people we'll look at in this class would be considered wise on some level. They're tuned in some way. Now let's contrast that with knowledge. Because knowledge we would think of as book smarts, right? Somebody who has a couple PhDs, we'd say, oh, they're very knowledgeable. And yet sometimes we wouldn't always consider those people wise. Knowledge actually has a specific definition in philosophy and in the academic world more generally, and that is that knowledge is justified true belief. So knowledge is belief that happens to be justified and true. Let's focus on belief first for a minute, and then we'll get back to knowledge, because knowledge is a specific type of belief, like I said, that happens to be justified and true. But what's a belief to begin with? Well, a belief is just an acceptance that something is there, that exists, that it's right, that it's true. A belief means we put something of ourselves into it. But notice that there's varying levels of belief. Some beliefs we're very attached to, we put a lot of ourselves into, and other beliefs we put very little of ourselves into. So, right, if I were to tell all of you that there was this great new taco stand in San Diego that you have to try, say on Adams Avenue in Normal Heights, for those of you familiar with the area, let's say I said there was this amazing new taco truck. But let's say I went there and I was full of shit. I was wrong. There wasn't really a taco truck. I was lying to you. You would have had the belief that there was a taco truck at the beginning. If you believed me, you would have believed that there was a taco truck. But when you saw that I was full of it and you saw that it wasn't there, and maybe later I tell you I'm lying, you're not going to change your whole life because that belief is shattered, right? So you had a belief there's a taco truck, it got shattered. That's an example of a belief that you're not that attached to. On the other hand, if you were a believer in God and then suddenly you had a terrible tragedy in your life and you're no longer able to believe in God and your belief in God shatters, that's very different than the belief in a taco truck shattering. As I hope you can see, if you stop believing in God, that could change your entire existence. That could change why you wake up in the morning. So beliefs, there's varying levels of acceptance that we have for them. And the beautiful thing about a belief is that you can believe whatever you want, right? Nobody gets to tell you what to believe or what not to believe. At the same time, the beliefs we choose to accept guide our lives, as the example of God shows us. By the way, if someone went from being an atheist to suddenly believing in God, that would also change their life. Right? So there are some beliefs that really are important to who we are, where our acceptance of them changes everything. And there are other beliefs that we just don't put that much investment in. So back to knowledge. If knowledge is a particular type of belief, so the subjective acceptance has to be there with knowledge, but there also has to be the truth and the justification. And that's what is absent in other types of beliefs. So for instance, I believe that I'm holding this little remote to move my PowerPoints forward to a screen that you guys can't see. And I believe I have this, so I know that I have this remote. Why do I know it? Why is it knowledge? Well, I believe it. I accept that I have this remote. But it's also true, I actually have the remote. And secondly, it's justified because I can see the remote, I can see the evidence of it. I can see the remote in my hand, and I can feel it in my hand, and so forth. My senses tell me it's there. Right? So I know I have this remote because it is a justified and a true belief. Now, naturally, this gets much more complicated when we're talking about things like evolution or global warming, where the justification takes a very complicated turn, and it deals with studies and research and scientific evidence. It's complicated and so forth. But the basic principle is the same. To know something, it's got to be justified and true, and you have to believe it. So anyways, philosophers are lovers of wisdom. They also have knowledge, and they believe things. And so we'll go throughout the course of this class, and you get to kind of evaluate which of the philosophers you believe are the wisest or the most knowledgeable by judging their beliefs. So anyways, that's wisdom. Now, you'll notice in the PowerPoints that there is a slide asking you to reflect on one of your beliefs. You will likely be doing this on one of the discussion boards in the class as well, but it's worth just thinking about, why do I believe something I believe? And it doesn't have to be something big like God or that there's a heaven. It could just be like, why do I think the earth is round? Where did that come from? Is it because my teachers taught me, or what? So anyways, it'd be worth reflecting for a moment, if you have the time, on why you believe something. Now, the people that we're going to study in this class, whose beliefs we are studying, are sometimes referred to as archetypes, or philosophical archetypes in particular. Now, we know the word stereotype, and it's often contrasted with an archetype, so it's worth reflecting on those two and their meaning here for a minute. A stereotype, as I'm sure you all know, is some level of prejudice, basically a false, inappropriate generalization of a group or a people or a thing. Obviously, if I were to say all Irish are drunks, that would be a stereotype. It is a generalization of Irish people. Despite the fact that I'm Irish and I know many people who are drinkers who are Irish, that's not enough for me to say that all Irish are drunks. So it comes out as a false model of a group of people. That's basically what a stereotype is. It's a false, inappropriate, non-representative model of a group of people. Now contrast that with an archetype, which is exactly the opposite. An archetype is a representative model of a particular type of person, usually that crops up again and again throughout history. So when we talk about Socrates later, we'll see that he's a perfect model or archetype for what a philosopher is. But where we really get a lot of our literature on archetypes comes from the psychologist Carl Jung, who argued that there are all these different personality archetypes. And he And in particular, one in particular that is useful to help you remember what an archetype is the hero, right? The hero's journey. There's many different heroes throughout history, from Socrates himself to Martin Luther King. There are many different heroes, to Odysseus, to fictional heroes. And that is an archetype because it is not a distortion of what heroes do, but there are similar characteristics that every hero has. This is where the archetype comes in, a long-lasting model, the representative model. Heroes typically have to overcome some sort of obstacle. They typically lose something in their life and they have to regain it. They have to go through some sort of journey. They're often going away from home and will maybe return home later. You could ask a Jungian scholar about all the details there, but archetypes are an original model, just to simplify it, and stereotypes are a false, inappropriate, non-representative model. So this class will be studying archetypes. Every single philosopher we look at is a representative model of a particular point of view. We'll look at the feminist archetype later, who critiques all the men, all the male philosophers from the past. We'll look at the archetype of the theologist, one who believes in God and who uses reason to try to support their belief in God. We'll look at the archetypes of the atheist, the people who need more evidence to believe particular things and so forth. But each thinker we'll look at represented an influential example, a model of a person that got repeated throughout history. So we're looking at influential models, archetypes, not false models, stereotypes. So the branches of philosophy. You'll notice that in each new section, I list out the three branches of philosophy, which I'll explain in a minute. But the branches are metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory. And when anybody has a conversation, philosophers or otherwise, it can be classed according to these three categories. And as we discuss new ideas in the class, I'll show you how those are categorized. I'll say, oh, this is a metaphysical idea. This is an epistemological idea. This is an idea that's in the realm of values or value theory, and so forth. So let's start with metaphysics. Metaphysics means that you probably, by the way, of those three terms, I would imagine that at least some of you has heard of the term metaphysics before. Now, metaphysics refers to stuff that usually has to do with reality as a whole. The question that is asked in metaphysics that's most central is what is real, what exists. These are the questions, I should say. What is real, what exists, what is out there in the universe. So, for instance, later in the class, we'll look at people who believe that, and I'm sure many of you believe as well, but people who believe in a view called dualism, meaning that there are two levels to reality. There's the level of reality that we sort of inhabit here, the physical world, with cameras like what I'm staring at and this remote and you and me. But there's also a spiritual dimension to reality that goes above and beyond. And to some people that might be reincarnation into another life, or it might be dying and going to heaven or hell. But you believe that there's these two sort of levels to reality. That whole thing, dualism, is a type of metaphysical belief because it's about the existence of reality. Metaphysical stuff often is stuff that can't be seen or heard, but can be understood in other ways that, through faith or personal experience or sometimes scientific evidence. Things like gods are metaphysical, souls, spirits, these are metaphysical. But it's important to remember that metaphysics does refer to reality as a whole. So that means that anything within reality can be understood as fitting in some metaphysical argument or place. So anyways, that's metaphysics. Now, let me just mention one other view within metaphysics. Many scientists today are what are called naturalists. Aristotle, who we'll talk about later, was the first naturalist, somebody who believes that the whole world, the whole universe, is all made up of the natural world. So they reject dualism. They say there is no soul, there isn't this other stuff, it's all here in one. That too is a metaphysical view of reality, that there is only the natural world versus the belief that there are two levels to reality. So anyways, that's metaphysics. Epistemology means theory of knowledge. It has to do with, just like metaphysics has to do with reality, epistemology has to do with knowledge. What do we know? How much do we know? And so forth. So anytime you talk about learning, all the criticisms you probably have of higher education and school in general, those are all criticisms that are epistemological. They're about knowing. How do we know things? Now, in philosophy, epistemology is very broad. So it's not just the scientific method. That's not the only way we know things. We could know things just by making a rational argument in our own head, by deducing what needs to be done. Right? That doesn't require a scientific study, but that's also a way of knowing. We might know something based on our personal experience. Many people claim to have had deep experiences of enlightenment or finding peace with God, or they use different phrases to explain it. But they usually use their experiences as a type of knowledge. Well, I know that enlightenment is real because I had this experience where I was enlightened, somebody might say. Knowledge could also be faith. Right? There are some people who say, well, yeah, I don't know that God exists in the way that a scientist might know of his or her experiments, but, this person argues, I still know God exists because I have faith. Right? So that's another way of knowing. So epistemology is about knowledge, about knowing stuff. How does knowledge work? And by the way, as we'll ask later in the class, what does it even mean to know something? I gave you the definition of justified true belief, but there have been people who have challenged and questioned, well, maybe knowledge is broader than that? And anyways, we're going to work with the definition of basic knowledge, justified true belief in the class, but it's worth noting that epistemology can get pretty complex in analyzing what it means to know. The last branch of philosophy is probably the easiest to understand, even though it can also get complicated, and that is values. Anything that basically has an opinion in it is more or less what value theory is about, right? Anything that has a clear opinion. And the way I think about it is it's the should part of philosophy. It's the should and should not part, because it tells us what should or should not be the case. Should we have a socialist economy? Should we have capitalism? No, we shouldn't. Yes, we should. Should this painting be considered art? Right? That's another branch of values, is art. What do we consider art? What's beautiful? What's not? Or should it not? You can look up a guy named Duchamp, who in the 30s or 20s or 30s, I think he was a French guy, tried to argue that art was all meaningless. And the way he did that was he took a urinal. You just look up the picture. It's called Duchamp's urinal. He took an actual urinal from a men's bathroom and put it in a museum and called it art. And his point is that, look, we can call anything art as long as we label it that way. There isn't any real art here. Now, not everyone agrees with him. Some people would say, no, if you listen to certain songs, like, say, the Moonlight Sonata, that really have these beautiful, coherent melodies that seem to, if anything's called art, that would be art, one might say. But anyways, I'm just giving you an example of the types of debates one can have in values. Now, ethics, of course, is a big part of values. Are values just relative to the culture? Right? I'm sure many of you believe that. And a view called relativism, we'll talk about later in the class, is a very popular one. The idea that there is no ultimate truth, it's all just a person's perception or opinion, or that there is no ultimate morality, it's just what the culture's norms or laws suggest. And other people say, no, it's wrong, certain things are wrong because God, some people would say, well, because God has laws and we can't violate them. Others might say, well, it's just wrong to be disrespectful to other people. In any culture, it doesn't matter what the culture says. So anyways, these are all examples of topics that you'd see in values. Now let me just give you one last all-encompassing example of these three. So let's just take a religion. Right? How does a religion fall down in this category? Well, what's the metaphysical part? Let's just take Christianity and Islam, which are both, as we'll talk about later, monotheistic religions, believing in a single God. What's the metaphysical part of a monotheistic religion? God is one, right? God is a metaphysical being. The fact that usually it's some form of dualism, that there's a heaven and a hell and also a physical plane. Spirits, ghosts, that's usually part of it. Maybe not ghosts as much as spirits or a Holy Spirit type thing. That's all the metaphysical part. The epistemology part is, well, how do we know God? And Christians will say, well, you know him through the Bible, through faith, through personal experience. But a Muslim would say, well, you know him through the Quran, the Muslim holy book, and personal experience, and so forth. So the epistemology is, how do we know God, right? How do we know these things? The metaphysics is, what actually exists? Is there a God? And the values are, this is how you please God. This is what you should do. So the Ten Commandments, right, and the equivalents in Islam, there are many parts of the Quran that guide Muslims in terms of how they should behave. Right? So that's an example of, if we're just talking about a religion, of how it can be categorized into those three domains. Okay, let's talk about reason and arguments. And first of all, let me just mention that there's a whole class called Logic and Critical Thinking that addresses this, where the whole class you talk about different types of arguments and mistakes in reason, and we'll talk about soon. I'm just giving you a basic overview so that you have an understanding as we go through these readings, because philosophers and others will use these terms, and it's important to have a foundation so you know what they're talking about. But reason is just basically making arguments, and the way you can think of it is this. An argument is just providing a legitimate justification for why. Right? It's providing the why to something. If I say, hey, it's raining, and somebody asks you, let's say they're not outside, and they say, how do you know it's raining? And I say, oh, because I feel like it is. That's not a legitimate justification for why it's raining, so that would not count as an argument. But if I say, well, it's raining because there's water descending from the sky, I see water coming from the sky, so it must be raining. Now I've given an argument because I've given some level of justification. So you can see in the definition of an argument, it says at least two claims, one of which is used to support or prove the other. Now arguments come in two forms, where the conclusion is either guaranteed, it's proven by the premises, that would be deductive, or where the conclusion is probable, is made likely based on the premises, and that's the inductive argument. Premises just means the reasons given, right? The premise is the reason. The conclusion is the thing being supported or proven by the premises. So those are the basics. Now you'll see that in the reader, and I'm not going to give you a page because it does shift as I make new additions, but you'll see that there's 4 argument examples in the first chapter of the reader, and you can also get this online for free, by the way, if you didn't buy a copy. But I'm just going to go over those 4 and just tell you which is inductive and which is deductive, which are inductive and which are deductive. So the first one says, the argument examples, and this is in the section on reason and arguments, so that section will be the same regardless of the edition. So the argument examples, the first one says, most people who work construction are pretty strong. Jane works construction, so Jane is pretty strong. So that is an inductive argument because the conclusion is only likely given the premises. And notice the word most, because it says most people who work construction are strong. Jane works construction, so she's pretty strong. So the fact that it says most leaves open the possibility that there might be some who work construction who are not strong. So that means that the conclusion is only probable, because Jane could be pretty strong if she works construction, but because it said only most, she might be one of the exceptions who's not strong. Now, as you can kind of see what I'm doing there, when you assess an argument, you don't evaluate the actual truth yet of the premises. You just sort of assume what's given to you is true, and you evaluate it from there, right? Because now I could say, but wait a minute, who says that most people who work construction are strong, right? We could challenge that. But to assess an argument, I begin with just assuming what's given to me is accurate. Okay, I'm just going to do one more. I'm going to do the third one there, which says, we are eating fish or vegetables for dinner tonight. We're not eating fish, so we're eating vegetables. So once again, I'm just going with what's given. I'm not questioning whether or not they're actually eating fish or vegetables. I'm just saying, okay, the speaker of the argument is telling me this is what they're doing. I'm going to take his word for it. And this would be a deductive argument, because notice that if those two premises are accurate, the conclusion must be accurate as well, right? If it's true that they're either eating one or the other, fish or vegetables, and they're not eating fish, there's only one possibility left, right? And that's that they're eating vegetables. So if there are only two possibilities and they eliminated one, it only leaves one possibility. So that's a deductive argument, because given the premises, the conclusion is certain. Right? The conclusion has to be true if the premises were true. Contrast that with the first one I went over, where even if the premises are accurate, the conclusion could still be false. So anyways, that's the basic difference between inductive and deductive arguments. And so later in the class, as you go through the readings, you'll see me sometimes mention that this is an inductive or deductive, and now you have a basic understanding of what that means. Okay, so now I'm going to skip this next part. So you're going to be asked on the first discussion, most likely. In most of my classes, you're asked to complete what's called the carrot exercise, and I'll let you go into that and complete it on the first discussion. But I will talk about the sort of point of that exercise and the results here. So if you haven't actually completed that exercise, I recommend doing that first before listening to the next part of the lecture, or at least pausing it or fast forwarding, because I'm going to give some of that away here. So basically in this carrot exercise, you're asked to think of a number of different, you're asked to answer some math problems. And they're very simple math problems, and they all end in the number 14, right? What's 7 times 2? 14. What's 14 minus 0? 14. Seems kind of lame at first when you first go over these, but the point is that what you're doing by saying those numbers aloud is you're priming your mind with the number 14, right? Priming is a term in psychology, meaning that you're sort of getting your mind ready, you're priming it for another thought or another association. And in this case, it's the fact that 14 and carat are associated in our culture, right? 14 karat gold. So in this exercise, as you say 14, it primes your mind. And so when you're then immediately asked to think of a vegetable, for many people, myself included when I first did this exercise, their mind goes straight to carrot. 14 carrot, right? You say 14, 14, 14, think of a vegetable, carrot. And the point there is that if you do say carrot, it spits out an answer immediately. Your mind is immediately just processing information below your level of awareness. And that's important, as I'll talk about later. But if you didn't think of carrot, don't pat yourself on the back too quickly, because there's no right or wrong answer to the question. It just means that if you thought of carrot, it just means you had a little stronger connection between 14 and carrot. You may have seen the association more than other people. But if you said, say, broccoli, it means your mind was still working quickly and giving you an unconscious result. It just means that in your own experience, broccoli, or whatever you chose, is a more significant, has a more significant impact on your life. So for instance, maybe you really love broccoli, or celery, or eggplant. Maybe you ate it recently. Maybe you saw someone else eating it and it got logged in your head and you didn't really notice it consciously. And then when I asked you this question, you shot out the answer that you shot out. Right? Whatever answer you said, carrot or not, it's an example of what's called fast thinking. And you can see this explained in the reader as well. This is what's called this is a part of what's called the dual processing model of mind. And since we're in a philosophy class kind of trying to figure out how does the mind work, what is knowledge, it stands to reason that we should have an understanding of the most current updated theory of the mind in psychology, in the academic world generally. So the dual processing model is widely considered to have at least be more or less accurate as to how the mind works, with some minor quibbles here and there. But the idea is that our minds work in the quick way, where we just immediately take information, and then it works in a more slow way. So when you think of carrot or broccoli or whatever, that's your mind working very quickly. When you tie your shoes in the morning, that's your mind working very quickly. When you're on the phone talking to someone while also kind of doing a task in the background, like looking up your email, that's your mind working very quickly. Those are all examples of fast thinking. And we need fast thinking to help us survive. Right? Fast thinking is what tells us, if we're in the wild, that there may be a snake in the distance when we see a curved stick. Now, even if it's really a stick and not a snake, our mind needs to tell us that it's a snake just in case it is, because we might die, right? So the stakes are too high. So this whole idea of slow and fast thinking evolved for survival. Now the slow thinking comes in when we reflect. And we start thinking to ourselves, wait a minute, was that really a snake in the distance, or was that just a curved stick? I'm not sure. So that's when that part comes in. And slow thinking is exactly what this class is about. Philosophy is about slow thinking, because our minds are constantly working, just shooting information in our brains, especially in our fast-paced culture. Philosophy gives us the opportunity to slow down and say, wait a minute, what did I just say? What did I just do? Did I really believe that? Do I really believe what my parents are telling me? Do I really believe what my teachers are telling me? Do I really believe what my textbook is telling me? Let me reflect on this for a bit. Slow thinking is a deep aspect of human nature that is also deeply connected to philosophy, which is that we have to think deeply about particular things. The problem, as the text points out, is that sometimes it really sucks to think deeply. Sometimes it's easier just to play the video game, or to watch the show, or to drink the beer. But it's good for us to think deeply. It makes us better people. And all those things I said at the beginning of this lecture makes us smarter, wiser, more open-minded. So this little exercise about the carrot is just to illustrate that our minds tend to want to go to the quickest, most immediate thing. But what's really best for us sometimes is to think more deeply about what's going on. And that's what this class offers you the opportunity to do, right? And what is thinking deeply? It's using reason, slowing down and using reason. Wait, why do I think it's raining, right? Why do I believe this? Is it just because of this, or do I have a better reason for that? Slow thinking. So the reason this is a problem, as if it's not already obvious, to think more slowly sometimes, is that there are a number of ways that our minds derail us and push us in the wrong direction. And like I mentioned before, these are called fallacies and biases. So there's a slight difference. A fallacy is actually something that appears like an argument, appears to have good reason, and sometimes is kind of complex, but it doesn't. The reasons given are not good enough. A common example that I'm sure you've heard of is the ad hominem, where you attack a person's characteristics rather than what they're doing. Right? So, you hear this sometimes from students. Well, I didn't really like the professor. Right? I didn't like his personality or her personality. She wasn't very nice, so her class sucked. Right? Now, of course, that has nothing to do with how she organized her class, with how good of a lecturer she was, just because the student didn't like their personality. Obviously there are many, many ways that can occur, but that's one example of where somebody substitutes a fallacy, a mistaken reasoning, for an actual reason. And it's not actually using reason, right? The cognitive biases are dangerous because they equally, just like fallacies, pull us away from the reasoning process, but they do so in a more quick, immediate way. And in fact, cognitive biases are examples of fast thinking. This is why fast thinking can be dangerous, because it can lead to these biases where we immediately get the sense that something's right or wrong or true or false without the deep thinking process that would lead us to the right answer. And so these are both unique because they prevent reason from being as effective, both fallacies and biases. And if that explanation doesn't fully help you understand the concept, let me just point out that in the reader, if you go past the reason section into the fallacies and cognitive bias section, you'll see that there are a number of examples of fallacies and cognitive biases. So these are the type of things that you will lose points in the class for using on the discussions. You definitely want to understand them for the assessments. And just in general, you'll notice that you want to stop using these, not just in this class, but everywhere. Nobody likes fallacy use, and you don't like it when it's used on you either. If someone attacks you instead of what you're saying, for example, right, you're not going to be a fan of that. But anyways, it's not just the ad hominem. There's lots of different ways to be biased or to use fallacies. The confirmation bias is probably the mother or father of all biases. The confirmation bias means that we tend to already want to believe something. So, and we may delude ourselves into thinking that, I've looked at everything on all sides of the debate, but nonetheless, we've just confirmed what we've already believed. That's what the confirmation bias does. It makes us seek confirmation for what we already believe, even if there's evidence against it, right? So the confirmation bias can take a couple forms. Sometimes it just takes the form of somebody going online and literally finding websites that support their belief. Like if you're an atheist, you just go to all the websites that say God doesn't exist. If you're a believer, you go to all the theologist websites that say he does exist, and then you come out and say, see, look at all the evidence in support of my belief. Another form of the confirmation bias is misinterpreting or distorting evidence against your view. So you might actually get to the point where you say, oh, okay, fine, this does seem to disprove my view, but let me show you why it doesn't. Let me rejigger it and mess around with it and show you why it doesn't support my view. So this is all happening below our conscious level of awareness. And if you think especially about political parties, you can see how prevalent the confirmation bias is. Now, I'm not going to go over every bias here, but it's worth taking a look at those, right? The negativity bias is another big one. No matter how much positive stuff happens in our life, the instant that something negative happens, that takes prominence in our mind, right? That suddenly becomes so important. You just won $500 in Vegas, and now you want lost 50. And what are you thinking about? The fact that you lost 50, not that you actually are $450 richer. Fallacies, right? The straw man is another important one to remember, which is a misinterpretation of a person's argument. As you'll see on the discussion boards in the class, you are asked to paraphrase the ideas accurately of not just other students, but of the material. That's in an effort to prevent the straw man from occurring. False dilemma, assuming there's only two options, either you do this or you do that, right? That's another fallacy. And there's several other listed here. Appealing to authority, well, this is true because a book said so, or this is true because my dad's really smart and he believes it. This is true because everyone believes it, right? There's lots of ways to make a failed argument, and those are fallacies. And there's lots of ways to be derailed in reasoning, and those are biases. So in terms of reason in this class, on the discussions and otherwise, you want to be aware of the difference. Okay, so anyways, I think that pretty much concludes my lecture. I will add one more thing to end this lecture with, you'll see the last slide there has a picture of Ricky Bobby, played by Will Ferrell, from the movie Talladega Nights. And in that movie, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen it, Ricky Bobby, Will Ferrell's character, has a father who sort of abandoned him when he was young. And when he was young, he told his kid, Will Ferrell, he said, if you're not first, you're last. Right? It was a phrase that sort of, a philosophy that sort of drove his life, and he kept repeating it, and he made logos out of it. If you're not first, you're last. And later in his life, in the movie, he meets his father again, and his father tells him, he tells him about the phrase. Will Ferrell says, hey, you taught me this phrase, if you're not first, you're last. And his father tells him, Bobby, I was high when I said that, man. That doesn't mean anything. So Will Ferrell says, I lived my whole life based on that. Right? So he lives his whole life based on an idea that was just said by his dad when he was high. Right? So the way this relates to philosophy is that if you ignore your beliefs and you just let them kind of operate without having any sort of slow thinking, philosophical reflection, you're in danger of allowing something really stupid to guide your life, like what happened to Will Ferrell. Something that maybe your parents taught you because they didn't know any better. So this is my last argument for studying philosophy, is that it can make you appreciate what you've really been taught, and if really there's any merit to it, or if you were taught something just because the people who taught you where they were in their lives, or they didn't know any better themselves. So anyways, thanks for listening to this first lecture on philosophy.